collecting data up at El Reno, so it's pretty obvious if you get close to me. So anyway, just forewarned. But anyway, all right, let's talk a little bit about these cattle markets, kind of where we are. I think this is the same story I've told probably the last 2 or 3 times I've been down here, and it really hasn't changed in general. We've had some other things along the way, but if you had to kind of sum up where we are right now, cattle numbers are at a peak, I think. I'm still not expecting any change one way or the other. They could be slightly up or slightly down January 1, but more or less unchanged. Beef production lags behind inventory, so peak inventories now probably says we're not quite at the peak at beef production. And so we'll look at some of the numbers. We're still going to see some growth. It's slowing down, but we'll probably see a little bit more growth into 2020 as well. I say, this slide doesn't say it, but cattle inventories are peaking, but they're really at a plateau. You know, the history of the cattle industry is such that we've had inventory cycles mostly of our own doing. We tend to expand until we expand too much and tear up our playhouse, and then we liquidate and we go down until we get small enough numbers to have higher prices and so on. The one thing that's different this time is that we are at a peak in numbers. I think we've stopped growing for now, but we're not set up for an inevitable liquidation at this point. We're at a plateau that we can maintain at this point, and that's because demand over the last 3 to 4 years has kept pace with the increase in production that we've been doing. So, that's been a key to getting here, and it'll certainly be a key going forward. And so I'm still watching it. I've been nervous about it, partly because I knew the pressure we were potentially going to put on the market. So I guess it's my fate in life to be nervous about it, but I've been wrong so far, and that's good. Hopefully that will continue. I'll talk about a couple things that are a little bit troubling. So we're in a relatively stable environment within the cattle industry, but we're operating still in a very uncertain external environment. And so, we've got all these trade issues. You can go down the list. We haven't really resolved any of these at this point in time. So there's lots of things out there that can change, and hopefully we'll get some sort of resolution to these going forward that would provide a little more certainty, a little less uncertainty to the broader environment. I do think that's taking a bit of a toll on the economy in general, both in the U.S. and globally. But it sort of is what it is right now. We're dealing with that. We've been dealing with that, and so something's going to change eventually, and that will be what determines where we go next in the cattle industry. It's not really within the cattle industry. Again, we haven't really sort of done anything that needs fixed inside the cattle industry, but sooner or later something will change externally. That said, second half of the year has been a bit more of a challenge than we earlier thought for a number of reasons. We've had some disruptions. We had the packing plant fire, the Tyson plant fire in Kansas in August, which tore up markets pretty severely for a period of a few weeks. That's basically passed as far as the market impacts. In terms of what you see with markets, it's not necessarily passed because we're still dealing with it behind the scenes in terms of keeping up with cattle slaughter and so on. I'm going to talk a little bit about African swine fever. I don't know how much you've heard about it. I'm sure you've heard about it. You're seeing more about it. I think you're going to see a lot more of it because it's becoming very apparent that this is a big deal for all protein markets all over the world. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. And then, we've had some concerns, particularly as the year's gone on with the overall feed market situation. So cattle markets, we're watching the corn crop. Here it is. We should be nearly done harvesting nationwide. We're barely 50% harvested, and we still don't have any idea how many acres we have, let alone what the yield is or the quality. And so we've got lots of uncertainty yet in there. I don't think it's going to be a major problem, but there's, that's one more piece of uncertainty out there. I'm not going to talk about alternative proteins and dairy crossbreds and some other things that we're starting to see unless you want to, but they're not really market impacts at this moment, but they're things we probably are going to keep an eye on as we go forward. But you might be interested in this. The latest the latest census of ag numbers that we have were the 2017 census of ag. That didn't actually get published until earlier this year, so they're relatively new numbers for us. And it's kind of interesting how markets work over time, sometimes fairly slowly, in terms of big market signals about how we use our resources. And so a couple of things you'll notice: harvested cropland is down about 260,000 acres in Oklahoma, and we knew that's been happening. We've been harvesting less crops in Oklahoma. Pastured cropland, so land that could be used for other crop production, that's being used for pasture, is up 460,000 acres. And you know, if you look at it worldwide, the U.S. is just not very competitive on wheat anymore. Compared to some other places in the world. Anderson's been talking about this for quite a long time, and so you start to see those kind of impacts. Again, we aren't producing as much crops as we once did. So, you know, you see it there in terms of these long-term trends in land use. At the same time, of course, with this herd expansion we've been in nationally, we've been in it since 2014. In Oklahoma, we actually bottomed our cattle numbers in 2013, coming out of the drought, and started regrowing. And so you can see that beef cow numbers, the second line there, in the last 6 years have gone up 27%. Nationwide, we've added about 10% to the total beef cow herd. We've added nearly 3 million head of cows to the national herd, but in Oklahoma, we've added 27%. All cattle numbers are up 26%, and so on. So, you know, again, we've had a pretty dramatic growth, and I didn't have that other chart in here, sorry. I've been so many places and had so many variations on this file, I can't remember what's in what file anymore. But I have a chart that shows just how dramatically our herd has recovered, even relative to the national numbers the last few years. But anyway, this is kind of where we are now with cattle markets. Again, the second half of the year, we've just kind of laid there. It's been, you know, somewhat volatile, but really just, you know, kind of surprising. Of course, now we're at the time of the year when we wouldn't expect to see, you know, higher prices. We're really potentially towards the back end of the fall low. I think we're actually not quite there, or we're just right at it at this point. And we haven't really seen it drop a lot more in the last month. You know, we've had reasonably good demand relative to the numbers. I think we still got another week or two yet of fairly big cattle numbers. It seems to me the run was a little bit slower starting this year. So we had pretty good forage conditions early on. Some folks weren't in a real big hurry to move calves, and with some of the other stuff that was going on, there was other reasons why people weren't really in a big hurry. Feeder cattle markets have been a little bit better. I wish I could use a pointer, but you can't do it with these slides. Okay. Whoops. Have you tried using a laser pointer on these? They don't work, right? So I went back and pulled out the old pointer stick. So I'll do that. Whoops, where am I? There we go. Feeder cattle markets. So we've seen a little bit more recovery from the summer lows in feeder cattle markets. And again, we'll talk about Oklahoma. We were sitting back there talking about the fact that the demand for these big feeder cattle is relatively stronger than sort of the middle weight feeder cattle right now. And that's fairly typical this time of the year in Oklahoma. Just as a reminder, so here are those calf seasonal patterns that we were just looking at. When you put the others on there, it gets messier. But for bigger feeder cattle, typically we see summer peaks for 6, 7, and 8 weights, and then a little bit of weakness into the fall. The actual lowest prices typically are in February and March for those bigger feeder cattle. Slaughter cattle prices bottomed in September, more or less seasonally. Obviously, we had the residual impacts of the packing plant fire coming out of August and into early September, but really the bottom was corresponded to a seasonal low. And then we've had a pretty impressive run. In fact, at least on the board and in the cash fed cattle market, we've had a pretty good run since mid-September on these prices. Box beef market, again, you can really see the spike. This was 2 weeks after the packing plant fire, and then it took about another 3 to 4 weeks after that, and we were, kind of through that. And then we've had this other run up since then, and that's based on the market and good demand. And we've had awfully good demand there again that has sort of built that market as well as helped support the fifth cattle market this fall. We've had actually a little bit early seasonal demand for middle meats, ribs and loins, both went seasonally higher. Well, I should say ribs and tenderloins went seasonally higher earlier than usual this year, and part of that is the strength of demand right now. Cull cow prices, we were talking earlier, they've been pretty flat. They sort of built a little bit through the year, but then of course we're seasonally low right now. And when we normally are this time of the year, this is the seasonal low. Cull cows have the most pronounced seasonal pattern of any class of cattle. So it's not too surprising in one sense. And again, keep in mind that as we've built cattle numbers over the last few years, I was just looking a while ago based on our conversation before everybody else got here, total cow slaughter this year compared to the low in 2015, we're slaughtering about 1.2 million more cull cows in the country. So, combination of the fact that we just have a bigger cow herd, plus we were really low on culling rates back then, and we've gotten back to more normal culling rates as we have built the herd back up. So there's a lot more cull cows going through the market right now, both beef and dairy. We'll see the numbers here in just a minute. Corn market, just a couple of quick comments. USDA came out with their latest numbers last Friday, and they actually have the crop a little bit smaller than what's shown here. You can still find a fairly wide range of opinions. This is showing a corn crop that's about 13.8 billion bushels, 8.5. USDA's number last Friday, I think, was for 13.66 billion bushels. Either way, it's the smallest corn crop in at least 3 years, and depending on where we come out, it could be the smallest crop in about 6 years, depending on where we end up on this thing. And again, really unusual year because we're having a hard time getting harvested what's out there. We don't really know what's out there in some cases. Most of what's yet to be harvested was really late corn that wasn't mature when it got the first winter storms, and so it's pretty unclear what the quality will be. And you've probably been seeing here lately, on top of everything else, of course everything's wet, corn and soybeans coming in with the kind of weather we've had up north, well, everywhere lately. They can't get any propane in Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota to run the grain dryers. They're having a devil of a time getting grain dried. So some of these guys are having to hold up harvest, even though it's already late, to wait till they've got propane to dry it once they get it in. So it's just adding aggravation to that. At this point, it doesn't look to me like we're talking about major increases in corn price, and most of this, a price level that stays under $4 a bushel on a crop year average basis is probably pretty well factored into the market at this point. I mean, it does mean slightly higher prices at their cost of gain at the feedlot, but I think, as long as it stays in this range, we're probably okay. There is still a threat that it could go higher depending on where we wind up here, and we probably won't have USDA's final estimate on the crop, and we always get the final estimate in January anyway, and it'll be at least January before we really have any idea where we did come out on this thing. So there's still some risk out there. It really, as always, it comes down to ending stocks. That's what's going to determine price levels, because the market's going to worry about, running out of things. That's what markets do more than anything else. So we're talking about an ending stocks estimate that's still, somewhere north of 1.5 billion bushels. And as long as we stay above 1.5 billion bushels, we probably won't see any major corn market rationing. Between 1.5 and 2 billion bushels, and I think USDA's numbers with the adjustments they made on the demand side is actually showing a higher ending stocks estimate than this in those latest numbers, like 1.9. So we wouldn't see a lot of price action at those levels. Now, if it were to drop down below 1.5 billion bushels, then the corn market starts making sure we don't run out. And so, that's the way markets work. Markets won't ever tell you you can't have something, but it will price it so that some of you will figure out how to do without it, right? That's kind of the way it works. And so if we get below 1.5 billion bushels, we start rationing with price. Obviously, if you remember what happened back here in 2011, 2012, we get down around 1 billion bushels, the corn market starts getting really worried, and we start to see significant price rationing. We're not going to go anywhere near that. I don't think we'll drop even close, or certainly not below 1.5 billion bushels. So doesn't look like a problem, but again, there's uncertainty there relative to that. Just a reminder again, we've had cycles for 100+ years in this industry. The latest one, of course, here we've been expanding since 2014. The last time we did this, that's the other thing about touch screens, is they do things when you touch them, whether you meant to or not. All right. The last time we did this was in the early 1990s. From 1990 to 1996, we had sort of the most recent full-blown cyclical expansion. We had kind of a aborted expansion attempt in the mid-2000s that really didn't happen, especially from a cow herd standpoint. So here we are with this expansion. Again, we've been in it for 5 years, and the difference this time, most of these, if you look at them, have a fairly sharp peak. We go up, and as soon as we hit the top, we turn around and come back down. We're not set up to do that this time. Okay, and I'm betting against history here, which always gets me in trouble because history wins more often than not when I do this. But it really looks that way. And it's not just me, there's some other people that would tell the same story at this point, that we have the ability to sort of stay on this plateau that we're on right now until something bigger than the cattle industry changes and pushes us one way or the other. There's the cow herd, so you can sort of focus on the beef cow inventory again, what we've done since 2014 versus the last time we did it, which was in the early 1990s. So we've had more cattle, bigger calf crops, bigger feeder supplies, more cattle going through feedlots. If you'll notice though, this year, now in September, placements were slightly higher than a year earlier, about 2%, but part of that is we knew some placements got delayed in August because of all the turmoil in the market at that time. But really, May, June, July, and August all had lower year-over-year placements. That tells me that we're getting close. We may not be quite to the peak in this flow of cattle coming through the system. Okay, marketings have kept up pretty well, and so the bottom line is, starting in September and October, the last 2 months, we've had year-over-year decreases in the total feedlot inventory in the monthly report. That's the first time since December of 2016 that we've seen a year-over-year decrease in feedlot inventories. So we've worked our way, it looks like, through most of this. Now we may still build up here in the next, we've got some delayed placements coming in, we've got still this fall's calf crop to deal with, but if, we may build it back up and go above year earlier levels briefly in the next 4 or 5 months, brief for some period of time, if it's going to happen. And it may not happen, but if it does, and then we'll be at the peak. So we could be there already, or we may not be quite there, but we're getting pretty close. Steers on feed, we get those numbers quarterly. And if you'll notice, every quarter in 2019 compared to 2018, the number of steers on feed has been down. Okay, so that suggests that part's already peaked out. Heifers are still running above because we're still in the dynamics of sorting out heifers for breeding versus heifers for feeding. And so heifers are still above, but the that's coming down as well. And again, we're probably a quarter away, perhaps 2 quarters away from seeing those heifer numbers start to drop below year earlier levels as well. So when you put it all together, again, this sort of annual average cattle on feed number may have peaked for this whole time period. You'll notice it's the biggest peak we've had going back at least to 2000 prior to that. Or like I said, it may build back up briefly, but we're very close to the peak, if not already at it or slightly past it as we go forward. So cattle on feed numbers have been higher, more cattle coming through the system. So far this year, cattle slaughter is up 1.3%. That's probably about where it's going to end the year. We've got several more weeks here to finish out the year, but that's about where it's going to end up. That's about half of last year's year-over-year increase. So 1.3% this year, 2.6% last year compared to the year before. And the year before that, it was 5.3%. So every year, the last 3 years, we've been increasing at a slower rate. Okay, so again, to emphasize this idea that we're peaking out, we're coming in for a landing on the plateau here in terms of cattle numbers and beef production as well. Steer to heifer slaughter ratios, again, are getting back to normal levels after being at some extremely high levels 2 years ago or thereabouts. Carcass weights, that was last year. So far this year, carcass weights have been down. This is just the steers, but steer weights are down, heifer weights are down. Actually, cow carcass weights are down as well. So across the board, carcass weights are helping to moderate even that small or modest increase in slaughter. You know, that was something, again, you never know, at least it's hard to tell from one year to the next how that's going to go, this carcass weight thing. We have held it pretty well in check the last couple of years. I'm not going to go out on a limb and say we've peaked that out, even though I've talked to you before about my concerns about the long-term trend of carcass weights being probably bigger than the market can really handle, but that could still come back at some point. So I'm not going to say that we've peaked out on those things longer term, but at least for the time being, we've held those carcass weights down. And so a lot of numbers here, but beef production for 2019, up less than 1% probably for year-over-year increases. Again, coming into a peak, up about that same amount next year. In fact, I think it might even come in a little bit smaller than this, but still at a record level. So 27.3 billion pounds of beef next year would be a record level. Pork production this year is up nearly 5% and projected to be up nearly 4% next year. We've got lots of pork right now, but this is where the African swine fever thing really starts to kick in. I have a report that came from, I just got this, I don't know, maybe a week or 2 weeks ago, from Rabobank, International Financial Institution, and their analysts are suggesting that China in the last year has gone from 450 million hogs to under 200 million hogs. And I know analysts that even think it's a bigger decrease than that. And we have about 100 million hogs in this country, so think about how big that is and how big of a loss that is. 2018, they were producing half of the world's pigs. And they've lost an amount in China in the last year that's probably equivalent to 25% of the world's pigs that are dead as a result of this disease. Yes, sir.
How liberal is the China public to convert from hogs to maybe a shot at beef?
Well, the bottom line is, because of the protein deficit that exists in China right now, there is not enough meat on the planet, at least tradable meat, to fill that deficit. There is less beef or less meat of all kinds in the world. And even though China is trying to supplement their deficit, which is pork, and that is their preferred meat by a bunch, but they're supplementing it with everything they can get. Pork first from all over the world, but beef and poultry as well. So it's going to support all protein markets, and this is a long-term deal. China's recovery from this thing, assuming they ever get it under control, and they don't even have that yet. It's a tough disease. It's a really scary disease, frankly. Right now, fortunately, it's very specific to hogs. Viruses always make you nervous because they're very adaptable, and they can sometimes jump species, but that's a whole other nightmare story that we don't have to deal with yet. But China's loss of hogs probably permanently changes their hog industry because they're coming out of a very, extensive peasant-based production system, and that's part of the reason they've struggled so much to have any chance of getting control of it. is they have, essentially no biosecurity in their system. I mean, it's local markets, little farmers, handful of pigs. They move officially and unofficially. Markets are, very fluid, and so they've just had a devil of a time trying to get any control over this thing. When it's all said and done, with the number of dead pigs they've got, most of those little guys, many of them will never be back. And so what's going to emerge out of this eventually is a modern hog industry in China, but it probably takes them 10 years or more to build that once they get to the point where they can really get serious about it. They've tried to restock some places that have already had it and lost all the hogs and all that, and they can't even eradicate the disease enough to restock successfully. I saw something recently while I was at several conferences where this was discussed, and they're saying 80% of the time when they've tried restocking farms that previously had it and thought they had it decontaminated, and they get it right back again as soon as they try to bring pigs back in. Okay, so pork prices in China, retail pork prices are double what they were a year ago. So they've got a tremendous need for any kind of protein to fill that. They're trying to ramp up their domestic poultry production. Some of these hog guys are putting in chickens instead of hogs. And a few of them are even trying to run a few cows. But they're looking all over the world for pork, poultry, and beef. And I'm going to talk to you about beef particularly, and I have talked to you before about how much their beef imports were growing anyway. And this just adds to that. So from a U.S. perspective, as far as production, next year we're looking at record beef production, record pork production, record poultry production. Obviously, we've been setting new records every year for total meat production in this country since 2015. Now, knowing that 2-3 years ago was part of the reason I was concerned about beef demand and the ability for the beef industry to not see more price pressure from our cyclical expansion. But so far, we've not only handled the increase in beef production, we've handled the increase in the other meats as well. Beef demand is very strong domestically and through most of that period internationally as well. We'll see that in just a minute. A little bit weird this year. That's a technical term, by the way. I went to college to learn that. You have to take price analysis a couple times to learn to say weird in terms of a price chart. But choice select spread has been really strange in the second half of the year. Normally drops off to a late summer or midsummer low and then builds a little bit at the end of the year. A couple things are going on. I think it's got both supply and demand components. One of them, I don't think I got that chart in here as well. One of them is the fact that grading percentages have been lower this summer. We've been generally pushing to higher grading percentages over the last several years. And for some reason, and I'm going to say that because I only have a partial story to tell about why they dropped off this summer. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we had a lot of wet, sloppy, muddy conditions for much of the, not only spring, but well into the summer, particularly up north. And so performance was off on cattle. I don't have them up here, but we get some Kansas feedlot summary data, and average daily gains were poor through the middle of the year. Feed conversions were awful. Now they've started coming back this fall, so they look a little bit back on track, but the grading percentage was contributing to a smaller supply of choice and a larger supply of select, which would tend to make this thing stay wide. And then we've had, as I mentioned earlier, very good demand on the choice side for middle meats. So you put stronger demand and a lower supply, and you get this kind of a pattern on the choice select spread. Retail beef prices, again, same story. Think about how much we've added to total beef production since 2015, which was the recent low, and that's when we had the record high prices. We've come off of those record high prices a little bit, but we've stayed pretty flat on average since then as we've continued to add to beef production. I looked up that percentage the other day, and now it escapes me. It's like 12 or 14% we've added to total beef production since 2015 for this year. So it's a lot more beef. And again, not only is there more beef, there's more pork and poultry as well. So if you look at the ratio of retail beef prices, so beef prices at the grocery store to chicken prices at the grocery store, we've stayed at a record level, which we shot up to going into the short supplies and the high prices. Coming out of that, we've maintained that level. pretty impressive to me. Same thing with beef to pork. So again, beef demand has stayed pretty strong through much of this period. Okay. A little bit on global beef markets, because they are changing quite a bit. It kind of gets back to your question a little bit about beef markets, and African swine fever is just one piece of this story, but it's a bigger piece now and going to continue to be a bigger piece than we thought. This is the USDA's latest projections for 2020 beef production. Just as a reminder, the US is the biggest beef producing country in the world, followed by Brazil, European Union. China is next. China's been a big beef producing and consuming country for a long time, but not a big beef trading country until recently. India, Argentina, and so on. You can see these are the major beef, uh-oh. I don't know what we got here, but we don't want to do it. I want to say, remind me tomorrow, Cheyenne, then it's your problem. Okay? I don't want to be reminded 10 minutes from now. If you look at beef imports, up until about 3 years ago, or almost 2 years ago, this chart would have been truncated on this scale to right there. And for many years prior to that, U.S. was the biggest beef importing country. And that would have been the scale. Only in the last couple of years has China jumped dramatically in terms of the amount of beef they're importing. And if you add Hong Kong to it, which is increasingly the way you need to think about it, since they are actually part of the same entity now, we still get the data separately because we did it for years. If you add those two together, China is bigger than the U.S. as a beef importing country by more than 2.5 times. And that's just happened in the last couple of years. I have a chart coming up here, but I think I have some other things in front of it to show you how much it's grown in recent years. This is a major impact on the drivers of global beef markets. Okay, it's not the U.S. anymore. It was for many years. It's China. In terms of exports, Brazil will be the biggest country this year, followed by India. USDA is actually projecting that the U.S. might actually even be slightly higher than Australia. That would be the first time, I think, ever. You know, for many, many years, Australia was the biggest beef exporting country. They haven't been for a number of years. They're continuing to struggle with internal problems in Australia with drought. You might have seen news just recently. They've got horrific fire problems, brush fires, wildfires out of control as a result of the drought in 3/4 of the country. The other quarter is the part of the country that flooded last year and drowned 400,000 head of cattle. So they've had too much and too not enough everywhere. And so the bottom line is they can't maintain production in the short run. And at the same time, the U.S. has had, up until this year, for 3 prior years, double-digit growth in our exports. And so that's brought us up to that level where we're very close to, if not number 3, for the first time, again, probably ever, that I know of. So far this year, however, you can see on a month-to-month basis, exports have been a little bit weaker. And that's another reason that I've been somewhat concerned watching this, because those double-digit growth, you can see the last 2 years, 2018, 2017, we had double-digit growth, and it actually started in 2016. We had 3 years of double-digit growth in beef exports. So far this year, we're down, although it is moderating here in the last part of the year, but we're still going to be flat at best, probably down slightly. And that, again, is a source of concern. If you'll notice, 4 out of our 5 biggest export markets are negative year over year so far this year. So that's a bit of a reason to be concerned. Japan is the biggest one. You can see the percentages in that next to the last column. That was last year on an annual basis. So Japan was 28% of our exports. South Korea has been the only consistently growing market for the last 4 or 5 years. They're 20% of our total. Mexico's 14%, and Hong Kong and Canada have been about 10%. Notice that we're down significantly to Hong Kong this year. Some of that relates to sort of the official versus unofficial flows of meat that gets into China one way or another. That's part of it, and we've known for a long time we had to watch that. as we go forward. On the import side, again, up part of the time, down part of the time. We're actually flat, less than 1% increase this year. Last year was flat, the year before that was flat, all within 1% of unchanged, and the year before that was flat. So we've had really no change in beef imports in total for the last 4 years. There are some changes, the most obvious one in terms of sources and so on, in that we're getting 29% less beef this year from New Zealand. And I'll show you why here in just a second. Okay, so we're seeing some changes. We're actually up a little bit year over year from Australia, but that's from very low levels because they had been down because of their problems in the country, and they've historically been our biggest source. They're not right now. Canada is actually the biggest source at the current time, followed by Australia. So I want to run through both exporting and importing countries and just highlight sort of where things go and where they come from, depending on the situation. So in Brazil, 22% of their exports in 2018 went to China. 4 years ago, that number would have been almost zero. Okay, Hong Kong is another 19%, so effectively you add those two together, you're at whatever that is, 43%, 41%. It's a well-known fact. You can't do math in front of a group. 2 plus 2 does not equal 4 when you're standing up front. And you can see the other countries, Egypt, Chile, EU, Iran, and so on in terms of Brazil. But the big change there is China has grown very quickly to be a major share of their beef exports. India, I put them up here. They're in a very different market that really doesn't directly or even very much indirectly impact us, but you can see where they go since they are a major exporter. Half of it goes to Vietnam. Some of that meat, in fact, probably a significant part of that meat is getting into China via Vietnam. We've done that in the past too. It's not official, but it gets there. And you can see most of the others are Muslim countries. Most of their production is actually water buffalo, but it's slaughtered by halal standards, so it goes to Muslim countries. Australia, Japan's still their biggest share. The U.S. is second biggest. China is very close, though, 16%. Again, that would have happened just in the last 2 or 3 years, or 3 or 4, to see that kind of growth in exports to China. New Zealand, 42% still comes to the U.S. That was 2018. You notice the 2019 numbers I had showed that it's dropped pretty dramatically to the U.S. this year on a year-over-year basis. And when those numbers come out, it's going to be because the amount of their beef going to China has continued to expand very rapidly. So you see a theme here. Most of these major countries are, flows of beef are being diverted to China in many of these countries. Argentina, which has only kind of recovered their whole global market presence in the last few years, 65% of it's going to China, Hong Kong. I thought this was interesting. Last year when I was in Shanghai, China, there's this little trolley that runs on this long pedmal that goes for a mile or a mile and a half or something. And the Argentines who were advertising their beef on that. I thought that was kind of interesting because they've really been out of the global market for several years, just trying to come back. Their problem is political in nature. So some of you would say we can relate to that, but they have even bigger problems with their politicians in affecting their industry than ours do. Uruguay, China represents about 70% of their exports. They used to send quite a bit of beef to places like Egypt. Not anymore. They've just dropped all that. Virtually, the vast majority of their exports now are going to China. Mexico, I put this on here to show you how they've grown the last few years since they're so close, and we do represent the biggest share of that. So, that's a border thing, proximity thing. U.S. and Mexico and the U.S. and Canada. And so the U.S. is the biggest part of that. The other point that I would make is as they have grown as a significant world exporter, none of it's going to China. So where does China get their beef? Well, we sort of saw it. About, 50, 60, almost 70% comes from South America. Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay. The rest, the bulk of it comes from Australia and New Zealand. US is not on that list. Mexico's not on that list. Canada's not on that list. Okay, North America is not getting a piece of this market very much right now. China or Canada, I think, exports about 2% of their beef to China. We export less than 1%. And I don't remember if I saw a number for Mexico. I think I did, and it was less than 1% there. So here's what's happened in China. That's how fast it's grown in recent years. Again, from nothing prior to that, literally they were not a presence in global markets. And in the last 6 or 7 years, they've grown, and especially in the last 2 or 3 years, just exploded in terms of their imports. Just to round out the list here, Japan gets, the bulk of their imports come from Australia and New Zealand, with everybody else getting a tiny fraction of it. South Korea, same deal. The US and Australia primarily, a little bit from New Zealand. Mexico gets 82% of their imports from us. We get 86% of their exports back into the US. Those are not the same products, they're different products, which is why we do that. We do the same thing with Canada as well. Byproducts, I just wanted to put this up here. They've struggled for really the last 18 months. Pretty lackluster. Sometimes that's an indication of global market problems. Cattle imports from Mexico and Canada. Again, kind of normal flows. I don't really have a story to tell here, but we do get it, so I didn't want to leave them completely out. We get around 1.1 million head of cattle from Mexico, 1.1 to 1.2 million head a year. From Canada, it's closer to 1 million head, I think. And that's a mixture of fed cattle and feeder cattle from Canada. And we've done this for many years, so nothing's really changed in all of that. It's just kind of the normal flows of products on the continent here. So, summarize the price stuff. On this scale, which is very wide because we got the peaks in 2013 and 14, but if you look at it, we have had to lower our price expectations for 2019 over 2018 through the second half of the year, more than we expected to. But going forward, we've got basically sort of stable to slightly higher prices. Again, consistent with the idea that we're on a plateau now, and as long as demand stays good, we can maintain that plateau and we can maintain sort of the overall level of prices. Okay. Now, that assumes we don't have a big corn market impact, which still could happen, but it doesn't really look like it is. So, this is built off of sort of the best reading of the tea leaves we can make at this point. So, on an annual basis for 2020, flat to slightly higher, 2-3% is pretty modest. I mean, really, those are just kind of stable prices, and the same thing for 2021, whether we're talking calves or feeder cattle or fed cattle. Okay, so now we're on a plateau right now. Something sooner or later will cause that to change. Something, and it's going to be something external. Again, the beef industry hasn't set up anything that has to get fixed. We haven't done anything sort of to ourselves here that's inevitably going to get fixed. So, something's going to get better in terms of macroeconomic conditions, global economic growth. The trade stuff is a part of that. If we could tick off a bunch of those trade issues and get some resolution on some of those, we actually have the potential probably in the next year or two, probably not next year, but the year after, we could actually resume expansion. There's plenty of potential in this global market given what's happening to beef in China anyway, African swine fever supporting all protein markets. There's plenty of potential that we could actually resume expansion at some point. On the other hand, we could wind up in a recession. There are some threatening signals out there. The trade issues drag on and accumulate additional impacts, and we could eventually get squeezed into a situation where we go down. Okay? I can make the argument either way, and right now it all just depends on things we don't know. So it's sort of a to be determined kind of a situation. Stay tuned.
Like what are the...
What are the odds?
No, what's the... what causes it? What would cause it?
Well, again, same things that, the things I mentioned. So if we could resolve a bunch of these trade issues, there's plenty of potential in the global market for the U.S. beef industry to continue growing in light of African swine fever, as well as just the growth in China in particular, but in other markets as well.
What would cause the recession?
Well, trade impacts is weighing on the economy, and it is slowing down our economic growth as we speak.
Okay.
We are growing slower now than we would be if we didn't have all these trade issues. The global economy is growing slower than it would be without all these trade issues. Now, so far, they're just slowing us down, but there is the potential that they could do more than that, depending on what happens. And, what are the odds of that? Well, now we're talking politics. I can't figure out cattle markets, let alone politics, so I'm not even going to go there. And I guess, the biggest uncertainty that goes on top of everything else I've mentioned is next year's an election year, so all bets are off.
Darrell, when does the trade agreement with Japan kick in?
I don't know. I don't think we've seen those details. We have not, we don't really know, as somebody put it the other day, we don't really know what's under the hood on this thing yet. We have an agreement in principle. We don't know very many details. I have talked to USMEF and some others. What they think is in there, what it appears to be in there, is, if we get it done, it basically gets us back where we would have been if we'd have stayed in TPP, and it should stop the erosion in our market share in Japan. That has really shown up in the last, we were down year over year. Most of that decrease has happened in the last 3 or 4 months. We're beginning to see how much of a disadvantage we're at in that market right now. I actually did a meeting up in Canada in June, and they were talking about the fact that they were benefiting from us not being a part of it. They were pretty excited about that. So we don't know the details on that. Of course, the USMCA, the new version of NAFTA, honestly, it doesn't change anything if we get it ratified or not, but the uncertainty of tearing everything up is the problem with that. We're operating just fine under the old agreement, and from a beef industry perspective, and largely every other perspective, for the most part, if we get the new one in place, it doesn't change anything, but it removes the uncertainty. Okay? The risk in all of that is that we kill the old one and don't ratify the new one, then we got problems. Okay, so that's the risk in that one. Phase 1 of China, we know even less about that than anything else. Absolutely no details there. So who knows? I mean, if we get some sort of an agreement, it's got to help something somewhere, but I don't know exactly what and how that might happen. So, and then I had Brexit and the EU on there. That's the only one of these that we're not actually a party to, but we're still trying to figure out what they're going to, what kind of a divorce they're going to have, and that could have impacts for us. We just really haven't been paying too much attention to it up until now. It could jump up to be a bigger deal depending on the way that shakes out as well. Okay, so I think I've said all this. Trade macroeconomic threats continue, and that's probably going to determine eventually what pushes us off of this stability, relative stability that we're in right now. Inventories are pretty stable. Beef production is topping out. It's not quite there. Next year, I didn't show you a specific forecast. It looks like maybe exports have some potential to grow, but some of that's factoring in what if some of this stuff gets resolved. It's unknown, but it does look relatively favorable. Boy, that was good chili. It's hard to get up and talk after eating. So, cattle prices under the current situation until something changes are relatively stable to somewhat higher. Again, and that kind of is predicated on the idea that production peaks out, maybe the trade picture continues to be mildly supportive at least, and so that has the potential to push us perhaps a little bit higher. And this really doesn't factor in African swine fever could help that a little bit more. It's indirect right now. We don't export beef to China. Now we may see it grow, but with the tariffs in place, we don't really have much chance of building market share in that market. But because it's going to help all protein markets around the world, we'll see some indirect support from that. The pork industry is beginning to see some real direct support. Even with the tariffs in place, pork exports have gone up. I didn't put the 4 months. In the last 4 months, probably an average of about 400% year over year to China. So they've sort of gotten all the pork they can find around the rest of the world, and now they've come to us. We're sort of the last resort because of the tariff situation, but they don't have a choice. They are importing some pork and probably will continue to, which will help support our markets somewhat. We got a record level of pork coming on next year, and despite that, your bacon is probably going to get more expensive next year. So just be prepared. Okay, Jerry, here we go. Knowing where I was coming, this is last week's, it wasn't just for you, but there's a lot of stocker guys in this room. This is last week's, the green line is last week's average steer prices. That says Kansas. Sorry about that. That's Oklahoma. It's not Kansas. I checked everything but the title when I updated it. From being up in Kansas a month or two ago. That's last week's Oklahoma auction average prices for steers. Okay, the green line. The blue line is kind of a theoretical feedlot purchase line. So given what they are paying for 825-pound steers, this is, given the current cost of gain, or at least an estimate of the cost of gain, theoretically what they could be paying for lighter weight cattle. So to your point, and you're exactly right, and I finally have messed with this stuff enough for enough years and for enough seasons to figure out that we do this every year in Oklahoma. These 6-weight calves get way undervalued this time of the year. It happens almost every year in Oklahoma. A 6-weight steer doesn't really have very many friends in the southern plains. Now, it's not necessarily true if you get far enough north. They look at things a little bit differently depending on where they are. But here, and a lot of it has to do, think about, two sides of this thing, right? We've got stocker demand supporting calf prices over here. We've got feedlot demand supporting big feeder cattle. At this time of the year, we're pulling lots of season-long yearlings off, and we've got cyclically bigger numbers anyway, so feedlots have lots of cattle to choose from, and all else being equal, at this time of the year, they're really not very interested in buying 6-weights. They'd rather have a 7.5 or 8-weight or 8.5-weight steer for a couple reasons. One is bigger cattle generally give them less headaches in terms of health and other issues. The other one is at this time of the year, an 8-weight steer will for sure finish against the April board, and a 6-weight steer will finish against the June board. At least there's a high risk that it will. And so, and there's always an $8 break, at least an $8 or $9 break between the April and June live cattle board. So there's a period of weeks in here where the stocker guys don't want to buy that big 5 to low 6-weight calf for stockers. That's been true as long as I've been in Oklahoma. 4-weight steers in Oklahoma this time of the year always get overpriced relative to everything else, because old habits die hard in Oklahoma. We want stocker cattle, and by God, they got to be under 500 pounds. And I listened to some guys today in the back of the room up there, and they were literally, it was sort of like, well, if it doesn't come in with something under a 5, I'm not looking at it. It's just a really big habit. So we do tend to sort of overvalue these calves. Now, that's good if you're selling calves, but from a stocker standpoint, I've been trying for as long as I can remember now to get some of these stocker guys to pencil out a 50 or 75 pound heavier stocker than what they've always bought, and at least consider it. It's a tough sell. So that's just kind of the way it is. If you put all those numbers, now this is at one point in time, so this is not profits, but this is the value of gain based on those prices in this chart. So again, you can sort of see it, a 4-weight calf or a 450-pound calf, the first 50 or 100 pounds of gain has a value of gain less than $1. It gets up over $1 if you own them long enough, right? Because you get out into that flat spot. But if you go up here to a 550, they get better quicker. And a 6-weight even better, right? Because you're in that flat spot. In that flat spot, there's no rollback in price. So the pounds are worth the price. The additional pounds are worth the price, essentially. Or in some cases, they actually roll up slightly. And we were seeing some of that today, where some of these 8-weight calves, high 7s and 8-weight calves were bringing more than a 6-weight calf. It does happen nearly every year in Oklahoma, Harold. And so like I said, I didn't look at this stuff seasonally for a long time. I looked at value gain for years before I really did much with it seasonally to understand it. By February, this line will flatten back. Well, it won't flatten out, but it'll get smoother. It'll still have a little bit of a curve to it, but it will fill in this. It'll fill in this hole and be a smoother line. If I have an example of that. Well, that's kind of what a long-term one looks like. And it will do that. And it'll do that on any year if you average out the whole year. That's what that relationship looks like on average. But what I've learned finally in Oklahoma is that seasonally it's going to have some pretty pronounced shape to it. That does, and I wrote an article this week talking about the fact that if you're a stalker guy, if you're going to buy here or, here, you're going to get into the money a lot quicker if you buy closer to that bend in that line. If you're a cow-calf guy and you're thinking about retaining ownership, if you're only going to put 100 pounds on them, you don't get a lot of value of gain for that 100 pounds. If you keep them for 200 pounds, the second 100 pounds pays better. So there's some tactical decisions there about sort of where you are at. If your weaning weight's heavy enough, retaining ownership is going to make more sense quicker than a lighter weight calf, unless you're going to own them a longer time. So there's some things to think about, and this does happen nearly every year. Question? Comment? I had several audiences that were this quiet when I get done, and I'm really getting nervous about what the heck that means.
How many of those trade agreements have to be approved by Congress?
Oh my gosh. I'm trying to think if the answer is less than all of them. But I'm not sure. Honestly, I have to work on that a little bit. Obviously, USMCA does. I'm not positive on the others off the top of my head.
Because they're not moving fast on anything.
Well, they're not new. They're not driven by legislation. So I think the others maybe can be, but without Congress. But I'm not sure. I have not had that question, so now I will be better prepared the next time it comes up after I check it out. Yes.
On your carcass weight, slaughter weights,
Yeah.
do you have any information about the yield grade on those slaughter weights and how that's affecting value? And I realize we got all these different grids, and some of them's paying a premium for primes, and primes are fat, and
Well, in general they are. I mean, that typically, right? Although, the unicorn cattle that we're looking for, and there are some of them out there that will grade prime and be a yield grade 1.
well,
Now, there's about 6 of them, but there's a whole bunch of them, potentially, if we can locate them, that are prime, yield grade 2s, or maybe 3s. I don't think we have and the carcass weights have been down, so whatever, we have not had a significant yield grade problem for a while. And certainly less of a tendency when
the
these,
difference between choice and select would make you think that maybe they were pretty high yield grade. I mean, and this comes strictly from a guy that only deals with purebred cattle, but purebred cattle have got the smaller frame and much more early maturing, because those kind of cattle look good on weaning weight and yearling weight EPDs. And cattle are just like you and me. When you quit growing up, you start growing out.
yes,
And so I'm kind of,
happens to me every time I get in an elevator and it's full, and I tell them, well, I turned sideways, but it don't help. Okay?
One of the things I'm concerned about is, well, back in the 60s when I was in college, we were slaughtering cattle with 3 inches of back fat, and that tail has to go somewhere.
Yeah, we have been doing that for a pretty long
A
time.
long time.
Right.
And so, but are we headed back there? Is what I'm.
I don't think so. And actually, I'm kind of glad to hear you say what you're saying about the cattle at the purebred level getting smaller, because, and I have some other research and so on and so forth to think that we we have been at times really pushing our luck on the size of these carcasses. And the thing that has changed genetically in general for cattle is that now they have the ability to go to 14 or 15 or 1,600 pounds and not put on back fat because of the kind of genetics and the technology we use. Beta agonists, implants, and the ionophores, that's the other one I'm trying to think of. All of those technologies combined with the way we have changed genetics in the last 15 years or so in this industry, these cattle have the ability to feed to much bigger weights but not get into the yield grade 4 problem. So we haven't really had a Y4 problem in quite a long time. But we can still have a carcass weight problem because they can get so dang big. And the problem is on the demand side, not on the supply side. I mean, they feed relatively efficiently and so on, but somebody's got to eat them and they get bigger. And so there are some issues there, potentially. But we've moderated that the last couple of years. I'm not willing to say we as a trend have peaked out, but maybe. I think it would probably be a good thing. And you know, it's one thing to talk about feedlot cattle getting bigger as long as they're efficient and productive, but the problem is, you know, at the same time that was happening, the cows in the country got bigger, and I know they're not always efficient as they once were. And so, I've told you this before, but you know what I say the average weight of cows is in Oklahoma? It's whatever the guy says it is plus 250 pounds. Because most guys honestly don't have a clue how big their cows are until maybe they cull one and they say, oh, that 1,200 pound cow weighed 1,450 or 1,500 or 1,600 pounds. And that's in the fall coming in after calving or whatever. Yeah, they're big.
We had a guy one time in the meeting I went to, said the average weight in Kansas was 1,380 pounds.
Yeah.
I really don't know that they're that big in Oklahoma, but I'm sure they're 12.
I bet they are. I bet they are in Oklahoma.
We got some lot bigger.
And if you go to Nebraska or South Dakota, they're 1,550 pounds. Those cattle have been bigger up there for a long time, but they've gotten bigger. You know, they didn't just stay the same while we got bigger. Everybody gotten bigger over time. Okay, I don't want to drag this out. I'm willing to stay and discuss as long as you want.
What about this fake meat?
What about fake meat? You know,
Have you had any? Have you tasted
you
any
know,
of it?
I was going to do it. I am going to do it.
I haven't either.
I haven't figured out how to
Has
slink
anybody
in.
here ate it?
And
Anybody tried
I
it?
really
don't
need
want
to. I really need to.
I don't want to, but anyway.
I'm going to have my son go buy one for me, I think. I'm afraid somebody might see me. And I can argue very legitimately that I need to try it, and I actually intend to, but I haven't done it yet. We're going to watch it. I mean, it's not going to go away. I think that's for sure. The plant-based meat, okay? There's two different things. Now, the cell culture stuff, I think you can pretty much not worry about. It's a long ways away from ever being anything for a variety of reasons, in my opinion. What I think I know about it. The plant stuff is here, and it's not going to go away, but I also don't think it's going to have anything more than a specific niche. I think we're starting to see some of that. There's been some recent news. Some of the luster's worn off of this in the last few months with people figuring out, first of all, this stuff is highly processed. It doesn't have a clean label, and it has a ton of salt in it. So health-wise, it's not something you can defend very far. And you know, if you get past a bunch of the hype, it's not necessarily environmentally any friendlier than anything else, I think. That probably comes later. But the other thing we're seeing is just, you know, and you probably saw this, oh, it's been several months ago now, Burger King announced or reported that because of the Impossible Whopper, they're actually selling more regular Whoppers. Yeah, if you think about it, what every restaurant and every grocery store is trying to do is offer a portfolio of products that maximizes traffic. And so the idea is, you know, if there's 5 people and 4 of them want a hamburger and one of them adamantly does not want a hamburger, they may go somewhere else entirely to satisfy that one person, whereas they can come to Burger King now, one of them can have an Impossible Whopper, the other 4 buy a regular Whopper, and Burger King sells more of both. Okay, and I think that's actually what you're seeing. That's the reason most of these big meat companies have gotten in on it, because they can't afford not to have that portfolio of products, depending on how important it turns out to be. So I'm not that worried about it at this point. I don't think it's going away, but I also don't think it's necessarily a big replacement for beef. I think most people who want beef, I've said this before, who really want beef are gonna go buy beef instead of something that's like beef. I mean, I just have a hard time with those preferences, but anyway. So I don't think it's a big deal. Now, again, we gotta watch it. I mean, there's lots of dynamics. It's early in the process. But I think it settles into a fairly small niche going forward. You know, again, restaurants do that. I mean, I don't know that any of the steakhouses are gonna have an Impossible Burger on their menu, but even the highest end steakhouse you can go to has got one chicken entree. Why do they have that? Because somebody in a group doesn't want steak, at least not that night. So, you know, you offer a portfolio of products. And I think this thing fits into that as well, for some people. Now, my ability as a futurist has been proven poor many times over, so stay tuned, pay attention, but I just don't see it being a big issue at this point. Certainly not in the immediate future. Anything else?
Are we looking at any new processing facilities in light of what's happened this fall?
I am not aware of any plans for new investment in packing plants. I mean, this does illustrate that, you know, it took about 30 years, but we did eventually whittle down chronic excess capacity. And then with the expansion in numbers we've had in the last 5 years, those two things reached a point where we're pretty maxed out at this point. I've seen estimates, and they vary somewhat, but, you know, prior to the plant fire, we were probably operating somewhere around 91% plus or minus. And, you know, you're not going to run it at 100% ever. That's like having your car maxed out all the time. You're not going to do that. So you take 5 or 6% out of the industry, then with that fire, that puts us up over 95%. And that really does squeeze things. So that part is kind of a squeeze. Now that plant's, as far as I know, still going to come back online probably the first of the year. And numbers are probably not going to get much bigger than they are right now. So we're probably okay in the short run, as long as we don't have another fire between now and January 1. That is a scary prospect. You know, we had that little fire at the Cargill plant right down the road, but it didn't shut things down only for 2 days, I think it was. But the other side, to answer your question, is that we have not made any significant new investment in the packing industry for beef in this country since the 80s. I mean, that plant that burned was kind of the latest, greatest state-of-the-art facility in about 1980. I think it was built in 78 or 79, somewhere along in there. And, you know, we haven't really added a major mainline packing plant since not too long after that. So we have a relatively old, and now they've all expanded and upgraded and done some things, but nevertheless, the fundamental infrastructure is fairly old. And again, we have finally got to a point where we're close enough to balance that if we were to take off and try to grow again, that might provide enough incentive for somebody to think about building some new facilities. But I haven't seen anybody talking about that yet.
They built the new plant in Mexico, right, several years ago?
Yes.
That thing running full bore, I guess?
Yes. Yeah, Jay was down there last year. We did get to go visit that. It's the most modern packing plant on this continent, I guess, amongst U.S., Mexico, and Canada. And it sits right next to a 160,000 head feedlot. In fact, I think I heard the other day that they're actually expanding it a little bit more. I think it's going to be close to 200,000 head here in the next few months. And that lot was full the day we were there, and the plant has been running full tilt. You saw how Mexico's growth and exports has gone. So.
A lot of those cattle have previously been killed in the U.S.
Yeah, interestingly enough, and this is something I can't figure out entirely is that I thought as that stuff happened in Mexico, it would squeeze the numbers coming up here. It hasn't thus far, very much. And so I'm still, and of course, we don't have very good data to work with, but I'm still trying to reconcile all of that. I do know that because of the market in Mexico and in the U.S., that's provided a lot of economic incentive. We have sucked a lot of cattle out of the jungles in Central America. And a bunch of that was illegal too. And so that's created some issues. But those are really small countries, and I didn't think they could do that very long. But somehow or another, we keep finding more cattle. I don't know. So what's happening a lot of times is the Mexican cattle is either going up north to their industry or coming up here, and then they're backfilling the Mexican market with Central American cattle. Remember when we went to that feedlot down in Veracruz 3 years ago, 4 years ago? Now, if you ask that guy, and I did ask him that day, that plant, are there any Central American cattle here? No, we aren't feeding Central American cattle, officially. Unofficially, everybody knows that a bunch of those feedlots that have been built in southern Mexico are feeding Central American cattle.
Have they got that much corn in that area?
They're adding more. Veracruz is a port city. They import corn from us. Okay, and they sit right down, yeah. You know, the cattle feeding industry has really grown in the last 20 years, about 20 years in that area. There was always some up north. This is farther south. But even way back then, they had a big egg laying industry. And I actually visited with a guy, this was 20 years ago, who bought for one of those big egg companies. He said he bought on average one ocean tanker load of sorghum a month from the U.S. primarily. Now they buy corn instead of sorghum, but back then it was mostly sorghum. So. Once again, you're very quiet. It must be time to be done for the night. It's been kind of a long day, so.
We can bring somebody from Anadarko over for you.
Yeah, that was a more lively meeting, wasn't it? All right, well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.